Detective Agatha Marple, Trained to Perdition. A Detective Tales. The Celestial Express stood gleaming under the waning afternoon sun, its polished brass fittings and rich mahogany panels an ode to opulence. Porters in sharp uniforms darted to and fro, hefting trunks and cases, their movements precise yet laden with urgency. Steam hissed rhythmically from the engine, mingling with the murmur of conversation as Europe's elite prepared to board. Detective Agatha Marple stepped onto the platform with a quiet air, her small frame unassuming against the bustling crowd. Dressed in a plain, sensible traveling suit, she could have been mistaken for a governess or an aging librarian, precisely how she preferred it. Her gaze flitted from one face to the next, cataloguing details with the precision of a botanist examining rare flora. A man with a booming voice and a self-important gait caught her eye as he berated a porter struggling with an oversized trunk. Dr. Percival Harrington. Agatha recognized from her briefing a renowned archaeologist with a flair for theatrics. His florid complexion and ostentatious gold pocket watch screamed excess, while his exaggerated gestures hinted at a man accustomed to being the center of attention. Agatha shifted her gaze to the woman trailing Harrington at a safe distance. Dr. Evelyn Montague, neatly dressed in a somber grey suit, clutched a leather case to her chest like a shield. Her sharp features and tightly coiled hair suggested discipline, yet the subtle tension in her jaw betrayed something more, a simmering resentment, perhaps. "Tickets, please," a steward called, jolting Agatha from her observations. She handed over her ticket with a polite nod, stepping aboard the train. The interior was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over plush velvet seats and intricately woven carpets, while the faint scent of fresh polish lingered in the air. Agatha's cabin was modest yet charming, with a single bed neatly tucked beneath a window that framed the platform's bustle. She set down her small suitcase and allowed herself a moment to breathe. The Celestial Express had all the trappings of luxury, but its confined spaces hummed with the promise of secrets waiting to unravel. The Grand Salon car was alive with a soft cacophony of laughter, clinking glasses, and the low murmur of conversation. Agatha, seated discreetly near the entrance, sipped her tea as she observed the scene with a practiced eye. To her left, Sir Julian Blake, a man of middle age with silver-flecked hair, held court among a small group of admirers. His tailored suit and polished boots spoke of wealth, but his languid posture hinted at a man accustomed to wielding power with ease. He swirled the brandy in his glass, offering a wry smile to a young woman's jest. Beneath his charm, however, Agatha sensed a calculated edge, a man who measured every word for its worth. Across the room, Madame Isabelle Dubois entered with a flourish, her presence commanding attention without effort. Draped in a sapphire gown that clung like a second skin, she moved with feline grace, her cigarette holder poised elegantly between gloved fingers. Her dark eyes swept the room, settling briefly on Harrington, who stiffened under her gaze. As the train began to move, Agatha noted how conversations shifted, subdued but purposeful, as if the passengers were subtly aligning themselves in the delicate dance of alliances and enmities. A steward passed by with a tray of champagne, pausing momentarily to serve Dr. Montague, who sat near the corner, her expression wary as she glanced between Harrington and Dubois. The tension among them was palpable, though none dared make it overt. "Curious, isn't it?" a voice murmured at Agatha's side. She turned to see the train's conductor, his demeanor brisk yet cordial. "The people we attract on this train, every ticket a story, every passenger a mystery." Agatha allowed herself a small smile. "And every mystery a lesson, if one knows where to look." The conductor inclined his head, moving on as Agatha returned her focus to the room. The pieces of the puzzle were already falling into place, though their picture remained tantalizingly unclear. For now she would watch, listen, and wait. Suspense was the train's true fuel, and the journey had only just begun. The Grand Salon car of the Celestial Express radiated wealth. Velvet upholstery in deep crimson lined the chairs, their brass studs gleaming under the glow of crystal chandeliers. The clink of fine china and the low hum of conversation created a rhythm that was both soothing and unnervingly precise. This was no mere train, it was a stage, and every passenger an actor in a private drama. Detective Agatha Marple, sitting unobtrusively with a cup of tea, allowed herself the faintest smile. Her role, as always, was that of the quiet observer. The train's opulence and its carefully cultivated ambience only heightened the tension she sensed brewing just beneath the surface. At the center of the room, Dr. Percival Harrington held court with the flair of a showman. The archaeologist, known as much for his theatrics as for his discoveries, clutched a small, ornately carved wooden box. His eyes gleamed as he opened the lid with a flourish, revealing a gleaming artifact, a disk of polished obsidian etched with faintly luminescent symbols. "Behold," Harrington declared, his voice ringing out, "a relic of ancient power, unearthed from the sands of Anatolia. Priceless, unique, and, dare I say, potentially dangerous." The onlookers murmured their appreciation, though Agatha noticed more skepticism than awe in their eyes. Sir Julian Blake, leaning back with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to commanding attention, raised his glass. "Dangerous, you say? How delightfully dramatic," he drawled. "Though one might wonder, Dr. Harrington, if the danger lies more in your imagination than the artifact itself." A ripple of amusement passed through the audience, but Harrington's expression darkened. "Mock if you will, Sir Julian, but this artifact holds secrets that could reshape our understanding of history. Unlike some, I am not content to sit idly by, trading in stocks and idle chatter." Sir Julian's smile remained fixed, though his eyes hardened. "And unlike some, I value discretion over reckless ambition." The air between them crackled, the tension palpable. Agatha, sipping her tea, noted the subtle shifts. Dr. Evelyn Montague's barely concealed smirk from her corner seat, Madame Isabelle Dubois's raised brow as she exhaled a cloud of smoke from her cigarette holder. Each reaction was a puzzle piece, a thread in a web of motives yet to be unraveled. The corridors of the Celestial Express were quieter now, the gentle sway of the train accompanied only by the occasional clink of glasses or distant laughter. Agatha strolled slowly, her soft-soled shoes making barely a sound on the polished wood floors. Her keen eyes scanned her surroundings, noting the way shadows pooled in corners and flickered with the train's motion. She reached the luggage car, drawn by a peculiar instinct she had learned not to question. It was a utilitarian space, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the passenger areas. The trunks and cases were stacked neatly, each tagged and numbered, yet the air here felt heavier, more expectant. Then she saw at a flicker of movement, a figure disappearing between the stacks of luggage. Agatha froze, her pulse quickening. She had no need to call out, silence was often a better ally. Instead, she stepped forward cautiously, her hand brushing against the cool leather of a steamer trunk for balance. The faint sound of fabric rustling reached her ears, followed by the sharp scrape of a shoe against the floor. Whoever it was, they were in a hurry to avoid detection. Agatha edged closer, her eyes scanning for anything amiss. There a small, folded piece of paper tucked into the gap between two cases. Agatha retrieved it carefully, unfolding it to reveal a hastily scrawled note, "Keep your distance, or there will be consequences." The handwriting was crude, the ink smudged as if written in haste. Agatha's lips pressed into a thin line. Someone was clearly intent on guarding secrets, and she had no intention of heeding their warning. As she turned to leave, a faint click echoed behind her, a lock being latched or a case being sealed. She paused, her senses on high alert. The shadowy figure was gone, but the sense of foreboding lingered like a chill in the air. The Celestial Express was not just a train. It was a crucible, and its opulent confines were beginning to show cracks. For Agatha Marple, the real journey had just begun. The Celestial Express glided through the rolling countryside, its rhythmic hum a lullaby of luxury and precision. In the Grand Salon car, the glittering passengers had settled into a tentative camaraderie, their conversations punctuated by the clink of glasses and polite laughter. The atmosphere was one of restrained indulgence, but an undercurrent of unease rippled beneath the surface. Detective Agatha Marple sat in an armchair near the window, her tea cooling untouched in its porcelain cup. Her sharp eyes, framed by wire-rimmed spectacles, moved lazily over the room, cataloguing details that others might dismiss as unimportant. A misplaced cufflink here, a too persistent gaze there, it was a dance of subtle signals, and Agatha was its unseen observer. Just as she made a mental note of Dr. Evelyn Montague's clenched jaw, the train gave an unexpected lurch. Passengers jolted in their seats, glasses tipped precariously, and a woman's startled gasp pierced the air. The Celestial Express, usually as smooth as silk, had betrayed its perfection for a single jarring moment. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Sir Julian Blake, his brandy sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his glass. What on earth was that? The conductor appeared almost instantly, his calm demeanor doing little to quell the ripple of alarm. A temporary disruption, ladies and gentlemen. A slight mechanical issue, nothing to be concerned about. Please enjoy your evening." "Temporary, indeed," muttered Dr. Harrington, adjusting his waistcoat with an agitated flourish. "This train is supposed to embody precision. I shudder to think what corners were cut in its construction." The tension eased as the train resumed its smooth glide, but the mood had shifted. Laughter was softer, glances warier. Agatha noted how Dr. Harrington's grip tightened on the small wooden box he carried, his knuckles pale against its dark surface. "Curious," she murmured to herself, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The sudden jolt had been a momentary disturbance, yet it had exposed the passenger's raw edges like a scalpel slicing through fabric. The dining car, resplendent with gleaming silverware and immaculate table settings, had become a quieter haven after the earlier disruption. Agatha lingered at her table, ostensibly absorbed in her dessert, a delicate lemon tart that seemed almost too perfect to eat. Around her, the hum of conversation resumed, though it was now layered with tension. It was a snippet of dialogue that caught her attention, spoken in hushed tones at the far end of the car. "A theft, you say? But how? And who would dare?" Agatha's spoon hovered midair. The voices belonged to Dr. Montague and a young steward who leaned toward her with a nervous energy. Agatha could only catch fragments of their exchange, but the words priceless and artifact were unmistakable. "It was in his possession," the steward whispered, glancing around the room. "I saw it myself. He said it was worth more than the train itself." "Then it's still here," Dr. Montague replied sharply, her voice tight with frustration. "No one could leave without being noticed." Agatha leaned back in her chair, her expression placid. The pieces were beginning to take shape, though the picture they formed was still unclear. Dr. Harrington's earlier theatrics with his artifact, combined with the steward's anxious words, pointed to a developing drama that could easily explode into chaos. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Madame Isabelle Dubois, who swept into the car with her usual elegance. She paused momentarily, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Harrington, seated 2 tables away. A smile, faint and enigmatic, curved her lips before she turned to her own table. Agatha's curiosity deepened. The tension surrounding Harrington and his artifact was as thick as the smoke from Dubois's ever-present cigarette. Somewhere within this microcosm of power, wealth, and secrets lay the threads of a larger mystery, one that Agatha was determined to untangle. The mood on the Celestial Express had shifted irrevocably. What had begun as a voyage of comfort and grandeur now felt like a performance in a tightly confined theater, where every actor had a role to play and a secret to hide. Agatha Marple, quiet and unassuming, intended to be the audience that saw through it all. The dining car of the Celestial Express was a masterpiece of indulgence. Candlelight danced on silver platters, the glint of crystal glasses matched only by the shimmer of the passengers' jewels. Conversations hummed like a well-tuned orchestra until Dr. Percival Harrington rose from his seat, his voice cutting through the air like a conductor's baton. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone both grandiose and slightly slurred, "I beg your indulgence for a moment of intellectual enlightenment." Agatha Marple, seated at the edge of the room, allowed herself a fleeting smile. The predictable theatrics of Dr. Harrington were as much a part of the evening as the consummation. He held up a small wooden box, the same one he had guarded earlier with almost obsessive fervor. Slowly he opened it, revealing a disk of obsidian that gleamed darkly under the light. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "This," Harrington declared, "is no mere trinket. Unearthed from the sands of Anatolia, it is an artifact of immense historical and, dare I say, mystical value." He paused for effect, glancing around to ensure his audience's rapt attention. Madame Isabelle Dubois leaned forward, her cigarette holder balanced delicately between 2 fingers. "How intriguing, Dr. Harrington," she purred. "And yet, one wonders what makes it so dangerous that you felt compelled to warn us." Harrington's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "That, madame, is knowledge reserved for the worthy." From across the table, Dr. Evelyn Montague let out a derisive snort. "The worthy? Or those who shout the loudest? Your discovery, as you call it, was built on a foundation of theft and deceit." Gasps turned to murmurs as all eyes shifted to Montague. Her sharp features were etched with contempt, her fists clenched on the tablecloth. Harrington's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "Careful, Evelyn. Jealousy does not suit you." "Nor does fraud suit you," she shot back. "That artifact, if it is what you claim, belongs in a museum, not your pompous little circus act." The room was electric with tension, the other passengers too stunned or too entertained to intervene. Agatha sipped her tea, her gaze moving between the combatants. If words could wound, she thought wryly, the train would require a medic. The next morning the dining car was subdued. The rich aroma of coffee mingled with the faint sway of the train, but the usual hum of conversation was conspicuously absent. Agatha, arriving at her table, immediately sensed the shift. The steward attending her seemed jittery, his eyes darting toward the door. "What's the matter?" she inquired gently. "It's Dr. Harrington, madam," he whispered. He's not in his cabin." Agatha raised an eyebrow. Unusual, but hardly alarming. "Surely he's taken himself to some other part of the train." The steward swallowed hard. "There's more. His cabin door was open, and there was blood. A trail leading toward the luggage car." Agatha set down her teacup with care, her mind already at work. "Take me there," she said simply. The corridor leading to Harrington's cabin was eerily quiet, the muted elegance of the train now a stark contrast to the tension in the air. The steward gestured to the door, ajar and revealing a room in disarray. Inside, the signs of a struggle were evident. A chair lay overturned, a shattered glass glinted on the carpet, and the box containing Harrington's artifact was conspicuously absent. The blood, a small but chilling smear, led out of the cabin and toward the rear of the train. Agatha knelt beside the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "This was no ordinary theft," she murmured, more to herself than the steward. "And if Dr. Harrington is alive, he may not be for long." Following the trail to the luggage car, Agatha found the air heavier, tinged with the scent of polish and leather. She moved methodically, her footsteps almost silent. The trail ended abruptly at a steamer trunk that stood slightly ajar. With careful hands she opened it. Inside was nothing but clothing, neatly folded. A decoy. A distraction. Agatha's mind raced as she considered the implications. Whatever had happened to Dr. Harrington, one thing was clear. The journey aboard the Celestial Express was no longer simply luxurious. It was perilous. The corridor outside Dr. Harrington's cabin was eerily quiet. Agatha Marple stood at the threshold, her sharp eyes cataloguing the scene like a meticulous archivist. The overturned chair, the shattered glass, the faint smear of blood leading toward the door, each detail whispered of violence and haste. She stepped carefully into the cabin, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. The small space felt claustrophobic, its usual elegance marred by chaos. Harrington's wardrobe hung half open, a collection of fine suits disrupted as if rifled through in haste. Agatha's gaze fell on the writing desk. The top drawer was slightly ajar, a single page sticking out like a tongue trying to confess a secret. She extracted it delicately. The paper was an incomplete letter, its contents cryptic. "I cannot trust them. The artifact is not safe here. If anything happens to me, the truth lies hidden." The letter ended abruptly, the pen's ink trailing off into a blot. Agatha's lips pressed into a thin line. "A man prone to drama," she murmured, "but not, I think, without reason." She turned to the steward, who lingered nervously at the doorway. "You were the last to see him, I believe?" "Yes, ma'am," he stammered. "Last night, just before dinner. He said he needed privacy to secure something. And after that?" The steward shook his head. "I didn't see him again. But I heard shouting later, near the luggage car. I thought it was, well, nothing out of the ordinary." Agatha fixed him with a piercing gaze. "On this train, my dear, nothing is ever ordinary. The luggage car was a study in contrasts. The meticulous order of trunks and cases seemed at odds with the growing tension that simmered aboard the Celestial Express." Agatha moved purposefully through the narrow aisles, her practiced eyes scanning for anomalies. Near the rear of the car, she paused. A faint smudge of blood marred the edge of a trunk, its surface polished to a mirror shine. Beside it, a crumpled piece of paper peeked out from the gap between two larger cases. She retrieved the paper, smoothing it carefully. It was a torn page from a notebook, the kind Dr. Harrington was known to carry. Scrawled in his familiar hand were fragmented notes. The disk must remain hidden. If exposed, consequences unthinkable. Dubois suspects too much Montague is no better. The words ended in a jagged tear, leaving the rest to agonizing speculation. Agatha's expression remained calm, though her mind raced. A concealed compartment in the trunk beside her caught her attention. With deft fingers, she pressed against the edge of the lid, feeling for an irregularity. A faint click rewarded her efforts. Inside, she found a hollow space lined with velvet. Empty. Someone was thorough. she muttered. The absence of the artifact was as telling as its presence would have been. By the time Agatha returned to the Grand Salon car, the air was thick with unease. Passengers clustered in small groups, their voices low but urgent. Rumors flitted through the room like restless moths drawn to the flame of scandal. "It's Montague," whispered a young woman draped in pearls. "She's always had it out for Harrington." "Everyone knows that." "Nonsense," countered a gentleman with a waxed moustache. "Dubois more likely. She has connections to the black market." Agatha positioned herself near a group that included Sir Julian Blake, who was lounging with studied indifference. "This is why I never dabble in relics," he remarked dryly. "They attract far too much unpleasantness." "Unpleasantness or opportunity, Sir Julian?" Agatha interjected smoothly. Her tone was light, but her gaze sharp. Sir Julian's lips quirked in a faint smile. "Opportunity, perhaps. But only for the foolish or desperate. I am neither." Madame Dubois, who had been watching from the periphery, stepped forward, her sapphire gown shimmering like a second skin. "Such accusations are tiresome," she said, her voice silk over steel. "If Harrington has vanished, I suggest we look to those with a motive like a certain jealous academic." Her gaze flicked toward Dr. Montague. Montague, seated stiffly in a corner, glared back. "I may despise the man," she said coldly, "but murder is not my style. Perhaps we should be asking why you're so keen to deflect suspicion, Madame Dubois." The verbal sparring continued, but Agatha paid more attention to what wasn't being said, the sidelong glances, the sudden hesitations. Everyone aboard the train was hiding something, and the truth was buried somewhere among the lies. As the train hurtled through the darkened countryside, its opulent confines seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as suspicion tightened its grip. Agatha, seated unobtrusively at the edge of the room, allowed herself a faint smile. The game was afoot. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the Grand Salon car, softening its opulence into something almost intimate. Dr. Evelyn Montague sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, her grey suit impeccably pressed, but her hands betraying her tension as they worried at the hem of her sleeve. Across from her, Agatha Marple sipped her tea with quiet deliberation. "I imagine this is rather unpleasant for you, Dr. Montague," Agatha began, her voice gentle but probing. Evelyn's lips thinned. "Unpleasant doesn't quite cover it. The man was a charlatan. And yet," Agatha said, setting her cup down with care, "charlatans rarely provoke such passion. It must have been exhausting, sharing a professional sphere with Dr. Harrington." Evelyn's eyes flashed with something dangerously close to triumph. "Exhausting? No. Infuriating, certainly. He took credit for my findings, years of work reduced to a footnote under his name." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "And the artifact, it wasn't even his to begin with. He bought it, unethically, from a questionable dealer, but you won't hear him admit to that, will you?" Agatha's gaze didn't waver. An intriguing claim. Yet even a wronged academic might not go to such extremes as to remove the offending party. Evelyn bristled. "Are you suggesting?" "No, Miss Marple. I may have detested the man, but I am not a killer. My quarrel with Harrington was professional, not personal." "Not personal," Agatha repeated softly. She let the words linger, watching as Evelyn's composure wavered. The observation car was quiet now. Its passengers dispersed after breakfast. Madame Isabelle Dubois stood near the window, a vision in emerald silk, her cigarette holder poised delicately in one hand. The countryside rushed past behind her, but her reflection in the glass was as serene and composed as a portrait. Agatha approached with her usual unassuming air. "A stunning view, is it not?" Dubois turned, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Quite. Though I find the company even more interesting than the scenery." "Indeed. Speaking of company, Madame Dubois, I was curious about your association with Dr. Harrington. A shared appreciation for artifacts, perhaps." The smile didn't falter, but Dubois's dark eyes hardened imperceptibly. Harrington was an ambitious man. Admirable in a way, but terribly reckless. She exhaled a plume of smoke. His enthusiasm for rare items often led him to unconventional sources, such as Roland Vasseur. Agatha asked, her tone light but her words barbed. Dubois laughed softly, a musical sound that carried no warmth. "Vasseur. A name spoken in whispers, often by those seeking to deflect suspicion. A convenient scapegoat for those unwilling to face their own culpability." "Yet you know of him." "Knowledge is not a crime, Miss Marple," Dubois said, her gaze steady. "And as for crimes, I suggest you look closer to the good doctor's other associates." Ambition breeds enemies after all. Agatha nodded politely, but as she walked away, her mind was already cataloguing the exchange. Dubois was a master of deflection, but her charm was too deliberate, her composure too practiced. Agatha returned to the observation car later that afternoon, seeking a moment of quiet reflection. The gentle sway of the train and the distant hum of its engine provided a soothing backdrop as she settled into a corner seat. A steward passed by offering tea and biscuits. Agatha accepted with a murmured thanks, her thoughts preoccupied with the tangled web of motives and lies aboard the Celestial Express. It was only when she reached for her saucer that she noticed it a folded note tucked beneath the edge of the cup. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded it. The message, scrawled in uneven handwriting, read, "Beware of the shadows. They see more than you think." Agatha studied the note, her mind racing. The cryptic warning was vague enough to be meaningless, but pointed enough to unsettle. Shadows, was it a reference to a person, or to something less tangible? She glanced around the car, noting the passengers' casual postures and the staff's efficient movements. Yet the air felt heavier now, the bright afternoon sun unable to dispel the creeping sense of menace. Slipping the note into her pocket, Agatha's expression remained calm, but her resolve deepened. Whoever was behind Harrington's disappearance and this warning was watching. And Agatha Marple intended to turn the tables. The luggage car was dimly lit, the faint flicker of the overhead bulb casting elongated shadows across the neatly stacked trunks and cases. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels on the track provided a steady, hypnotic background, broken only by the occasional creak of shifting luggage as the Celestial Express swayed. Agatha Marple moved cautiously through the narrow aisle, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. Her instincts, honed through years of quiet observation, told her this was no ordinary search. Somewhere amid the cases and crates lay a thread she needed to pull. She crouched near a battered trunk bearing Harrington's initials, her gloved fingers testing its latch. It wasn't locked, a fact that struck her as odd for a man so protective of his possessions. Just as she lifted the lid, a faint sound reached her ears, a whisper of movement, a scuff of leather on wood. Agatha froze, her senses prickling. Someone else was here. Slowly she rose, her back straight and her expression calm, though her pulse quickened. The attack came swiftly, a figure lunging from the shadows, arm outstretched. Agatha sidestepped with surprising agility, her unassuming stature allowing her to slip past her assailant. The figure stumbled, cursing under their breath, and disappeared into the shadows before she could see their face. Agatha steadied herself, her heartbeat returning to normal. She surveyed the car, noting the hastily overturned trunks and a faint impression on the dusty floor where the assailant had stood. Whoever they were, they had something to hide, and now, so did she. The Grand Salon car was alive with its usual opulence, but the atmosphere had shifted. The passengers, once immersed in polite pleasantries, were now guarded, their conversations clipped and their glances furtive. Sir Julian Blake sat near the window, swirling a glass of brandy with practiced elegance. He appeared relaxed, but Agatha noted the stiffness in his shoulders and the faint tension around his eyes. She approached with a small, polite smile. "Sir Julian," she began, settling into the chair opposite him, "I've been meaning to ask what drew you to sponsor Dr. Harrington's work. Archaeology seems an unusual pursuit for a man of your varied interests." Julian's lips quirked in a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Miss Marple, you're as astute as ever. Let's call it an investment in history. Or, perhaps, in opportunity. Opportunity." He leaned back, regarding her with measured amusement. Harrington had a knack for finding things others couldn't. His methods were unconventional, yes, but his results were often lucrative. Lucrative enough to risk a reputation. Agatha's tone was light, almost conversational, but her words carried weight. Julian's smile tightened. "One must weigh risk against reward, Miss Marple. Harrington's disappearance is regrettable, but I assure you my involvement ends at the funding of his expeditions." Agatha nodded, though her mind lingered on his choice of words. Regrettable, not tragic. Financial, not personal. Sir Julian, it seemed, valued the tangible over the sentimental. Back in Harrington's cabin, Agatha carefully examined the contents of his luggage. Despite the apparent chaos left by the earlier search, her practiced hands found a hidden compartment beneath the false bottom of a leather satchel. Inside was a velvet pouch, tied tightly with a silk cord. She untied it slowly, revealing a disk of polished obsidian, the artifact Harrington had so dramatically unveiled. But something was off. The weight was wrong, and the texture lacked the subtle imperfections of an ancient relic. Holding it to the light, Agatha noticed faint machine marks on its edges. "A counterfeit," she murmured, her tone tinged with both amusement and frustration. "And an obvious one, at that." The implications churned in her mind. If Harrington's prized artifact was a forgery, what had happened to the real one? And who, among the passengers, had known enough to exploit it? She slipped the counterfeit back into its hiding place, her thoughts racing. This wasn't just a simple theft, it was a deception layered with greed and desperation. The walls of the Celestial Express felt closer than ever, the tension coiling like a spring ready to snap. As she left the cabin, Agatha couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows, it seemed, were alive with secrets, and the train's opulent facade was cracking under the weight of its passengers' lies. The conductor's quarters were small but orderly, a reflection of the man himself. Agatha Marple sat opposite him at a modest table, the hum of the train filling the silence as she regarded his composed yet uneasy expression. "I understand, Mr. Petrov, that you're a man who notices things," Agatha began, her voice measured and reassuring. "And on a train such as this, one learns to listen, even when not directly addressed." Petrov sighed, his weathered face betraying a reluctance to speak. "You're not wrong, Miss Marple," he said finally. "I overheard Dr. Harrington the night he disappeared. He was arguing with someone in the corridor outside his cabin. I didn't see who, but the voices were heated. And what did they say?" Petrov hesitated, his fingers tapping the edge of the table. "Harrington accused the other person of betrayal. He said, 'You promised it would remain safe. If this gets out, we're all ruined.'" Agatha tilted her head, her sharp mind piecing together the implications. "And the other voice? Could you tell if it belonged to a man or a woman?" "A man, I think," Petrov said, his brows knitting together. But it was low, almost a whisper. The kind of voice that's meant to be hard to remember. "Indeed," Agatha murmured. "A calculated voice, then." Petrov leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Miss Marple, I don't like to meddle, but this train, it feels different now. Like it's carrying more than just passengers. Something dangerous is here." Agatha gave him a small, knowing smile. "Trains are curious things, Mr. Petrov. They confine us yet propel us forward. Sometimes they carry secrets that cannot remain hidden." The dining car was hushed, the usual clinking of silverware muted as the passengers digested the latest shock. A steward, a young man with a bright smile and a penchant for being everywhere at once, had vanished. Agatha entered, her calm presence contrasting sharply with the air of panic that had settled over the room. Whispers rose like smoke, thick with speculation and fear. "They found blood," one woman whispered to her companion, clutching her pearls. "A glove smeared with it, near the service car." Sir Julian Blake sat at his usual table, his expression carefully neutral as he observed the chaos. Agatha approached him, her tone conversational but her gaze piercing. "Another disappearance," she said lightly. "One wonders if this train will have any staff left by the time we reach our destination." Julian's lips curved in a faint smirk. "Perhaps we should disembark at the next station and spare ourselves the theatrics." Agatha raised an eyebrow. "And yet you remain remarkably composed, Sir Julian. A trait born of experience, I presume?" He leaned back, swirling his brandy. "Experience teaches one not to panic, Miss Marple. It also teaches the value of keeping certain truths to oneself. Wise advice," Agatha said with a small nod, "though one must discern between wisdom and avoidance." Julian's smile faltered for the briefest moment before he tipped his glass to her. The faint scent of Madame Dubois's signature perfume lingered in her cabin, mingling with the soft rustle of silk as she reclined on the chaise longue. Her sapphire gown caught the light, glittering like the secrets she so expertly guarded. Agatha entered with a polite knock, her expression serene. "Madame Dubois, a word, if you please." Dubois gestured languidly, as if entertaining a guest at a soiree. "But of course, Miss Marple. What is it this time?" "Another disappearance, I assume." "Not this time," Agatha replied, her voice calm. "I happened to come across something curious, a map, concealed within one of Dr. Harrington's belongings. It appears to be a detailed plan of his excavation site." Dubois's eyes narrowed, her composure tightening. "And you assume it has something to do with me?" Agatha reached into her pocket and produced the map, carefully folded. "I do. Primarily because your initials are inscribed in the corner, alongside a date that predates Harrington's possession of the artifact." Dubois's hand tightened around the armrest of her chair. An innocent coincidence, I assure you. I have a professional interest in such matters. Professional or profitable. Agatha's tone was light, but the question landed with precision. Dubois exhaled sharply, her poise cracking ever so slightly. You are clever, Miss Marple. Too clever. But be careful, there are things on this train that are best left undisturbed. Agatha inclined her head. A curious warning, madame. I wonder, is it meant for me or for yourself? As she left the cabin, Agatha's thoughts churned. Dubois's lie, though elegantly crafted, was a thread in the tapestry of deception aboard the Celestial Express. And Agatha intended to unravel it all. The Grand Salon car was quieter than usual, its subdued atmosphere a reflection of the growing unease aboard the Celestial Express. Dr. Evelyn Montague approached Agatha Marple with tentative steps, her sharp features softened by an uncharacteristic look of vulnerability. Miss Marple, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I believe we should talk. Agatha, seated near the window with her ever-present cup of tea, gestured for her to sit. Of course, Dr. Montague. What troubles you? Montague hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I know I've been less than forthcoming about my history with Dr. Harrington, but recent events have made me realize that withholding information may be dangerous. Agatha's expression remained neutral, though her curiosity sharpened. And you believe sharing this information might illuminate certain mysteries. Montague leaned in, her tone urgent. Harrington was a fraud in many ways, yes, but he was also reckless. He'd been making deals, dangerous ones. I don't know the details, but I know the name Roland Vassar was mentioned more than once. Agatha's eyes flickered with interest. You believe his dealings with Vassar are connected to his disappearance? Absolutely, Montague replied. And while I may have despised Harrington professionally, I never wanted harm to come to him. I want justice, Miss Marple. Not just for him, but for the truth. Agatha studied Montague carefully, weighing her sincerity against the undercurrent of resentment that lingered in her voice. Justice, you say, she murmured. A noble pursuit, though I've often found that the path to it is rarely as clear as one might hope. Later that afternoon, Agatha made her way to the luggage car, her mind spinning with Montague's revelations. The cramped space was silent save for the gentle creak of the train, and the air carried the faint tang of metal and polish. Her attention was drawn to an open suitcase, its contents spilling slightly from its sides. A passenger's carelessness, perhaps, or something more deliberate. Agatha knelt beside it, a gloved hand sifting through the disarray with practiced precision. Among the folded clothes and personal effects, she found a small leather-bound journal. Its worn edges suggested frequent use, and the name R. Vassar scrawled on the inside cover sent a ripple of intrigue through her. Flipping through the pages, Agatha uncovered a series of transactions, illicit purchases, shipments of artifacts, and cryptic notes about buyers. Each entry painted a damning picture of an operation that stretched far beyond the confines of the train. One entry stood out: Harrington insists on keeping the disc. Too dangerous to move now. Dubois remains the only viable option if things go awry. Agatha's fingers lingered on the page. The connections between Harrington, Dubois, and Vassar were growing tighter, but the threads remained frustratingly tangled. As night fell, the Celestial Express seemed to take on an entirely different character. The dim lighting and muted sounds of the train accentuated its claustrophobia, each compartment a self-contained world of secrets. In her cabin, Agatha spread out her findings, Montague's claims, the journal, and the counterfeit artifact she had discovered earlier. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the final image was still obscured. Dubois's involvement with Vassar seemed undeniable, her charm a veneer for deeper machinations. Harrington's ambition had clearly driven him into dangerous territory, but whether he had been a victim or a willing participant in his own downfall was less certain. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Montague, her expression wary but determined. "I need to know," Montague said, stepping inside unbidden. "Do you believe me, Miss Marple? About Vassar, about Dubois? Do you think they're responsible for all this?" Agatha regarded her for a long moment before answering. "I believe there is truth in what you've said, Dr. Montague. But I also believe truth is rarely pure and never simple." Montague frowned. "So what do we do now?" Agatha's gaze was steady. "We wait, my dear. The truth has a way of revealing itself, though it often requires a little encouragement." As Montague left, Agatha turned her attention back to the journal. her mind working through the tangled web of greed, jealousy, and fear. The shadows aboard the train were growing darker, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they engulfed someone else. The Grand Salon car was unusually subdued, the weight of recent events pressing on the passengers like a heavy fog. Agatha Marple stood at the center of the room, her slight frame and calm demeanor belying the storm she was about to unleash. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying with quiet authority, "we are all aware that the disappearance of Dr. Harrington, and now a steward, has cast a shadow over this journey. However, shadows, once examined closely, often reveal what they conceal. All eyes were on her now, including those of Madame Dubois, whose elegant composure seemed just a shade too practiced." Agatha's gaze sharpened. "Madame Dubois, I wonder if you might enlighten us about your relationship with a certain Roland Vasseur." A murmur rippled through the room. Dubois raised a delicate eyebrow, a cigarette holder poised elegantly. "Miss Marple," she replied smoothly, "I do not deny Monsieur Vasseur. My work as a collector has, on occasion, brought us into contact. But to imply more is inflammatory." "Inflammatory, perhaps," Agatha said evenly. "But your presence here, coupled with Dr. Harrington's artifact and his dealings with Vasseur, suggests something far from innocent." Dubois's eyes narrowed, though her smile remained intact. "Speculation is a dangerous game, Miss Marple. I suggest you tread carefully." Agatha inclined her head. And yet, when faced with truth, speculation often becomes fact. She turned to the gathered passengers. "Madame Dubois admits her ties to Vasseur, a name tied to illegal artifact trades. Dr. Harrington, too, was embroiled in this world. Does it not follow that such connections may have played a role in his disappearance?" The room erupted into whispers. Dubois, for the first time, seemed genuinely unsettled. Later that evening, Agatha sought refuge in the observation car, its large windows offering a view of the moonlit countryside rushing past. The car was nearly empty, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic clatter of the train. She settled into a chair, her thoughts racing. The confrontation had rattled Dubois, but it hadn't provided the clarity Agatha sought. There were still too many shadows, too many missing pieces. As she reached for her notebook, a sound behind her broke her concentration, a soft shuffle, almost imperceptible. She turned, but the car appeared empty. The attack came suddenly, a figure emerging from the shadows and lunging toward her. Agatha barely managed to twist out of the way, her chair toppling as she stumbled back. The attacker, a man in dark clothing with a scarf obscuring his face, moved with practiced efficiency. Before he could strike again, a voice rang out. "Stop right there." It was Sir Julian Blake, his usual air of detachment replaced with steely resolve. He brandished a heavy cane, advancing toward the assailant. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before fleeing into the next car. Agatha straightened, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "Sir Julian, I'm in your debt." Julian gave her a wry smile. "Consider it repayment for your patience with my cynicism." "Are you all right?" "Quite," Agatha replied, her mind already analyzing the attack. "Though it seems our adversary is growing desperate." The next morning, Agatha gathered her thoughts and her courage. She requested the presence of the steward, a young man named Edward, whose nervous energy had been apparent from the beginning of the journey. As she questioned him in a quiet corner of the dining car, cracks began to appear in his story. His answers were too rehearsed, his glances too shifty. Agatha pressed him further, her tone gentle but unyielding. Finally, Edward broke. "Yes, I was helping Vasseur," he confessed, his voice trembling. "But I swear, I didn't hurt anyone. My job was only to retrieve the artifact and make sure it reached him." "And Dr. Harrington?" Agatha asked, her gaze unwavering. Edward hesitated, then whispered he refused to hand it over. "Vasseur ordered me to follow him, to find a way to take it, but I didn't expect him to disappear." "I swear I didn't." "Enough," Agatha interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "Your role, while damning, does not absolve you from suspicion. However, I suspect you are not the mastermind behind this." Edward's eyes widened. "It's not me. It's—" A sudden commotion in the next car cut him off. Agatha's lips tightened. The game was nearing its end, but the true mastermind remained in the shadows. For now. The hum of the Celestial Express felt ominously steady, a sound that masked the storm brewing beneath its luxurious veneer. Agatha Marple sat in the quiet solitude of her cabin, her mind working through the fragments of a plan. The clues had coalesced into a chilling realization. The killer's motives weren't limited to theft or revenge. They intended to derail the train entirely, wiping away evidence and lives in one catastrophic act. She closed her eyes briefly, replaying every interaction, every overheard whisper. The train's route was perilous, cutting through steep mountain passes. A calculated sabotage at the right moment could send the entire Celestial Express into the abyss. Agatha stood abruptly. There was no time for hesitation. The remaining pieces of Harrington's collection, particularly the counterfeit artifact, were still aboard. These were the bait, and she would need to use them wisely. The Grand Salon car was tense, the passengers subdued as whispers of danger crept through the air. Agatha entered with her usual unassuming grace, but her eyes sparkled with determination. She gathered the passengers and staff, speaking with a calm authority that left no room for doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "it is evident that this journey has taken a darker turn. However, I believe I have a means to end this ordeal." Madame Dubois arched a brow. "Do enlighten us, Miss Marple. We are all eager for resolution." Agatha held up a small box, its surface polished and unassuming. "Dr. Harrington's prized artifact, or what remains of it, is still in our possession. It seems clear to me that this is the object of the killer's obsession. I propose we leave it in a neutral location, a calculated risk to draw them out." The room buzzed with murmurs of unease. Sir Julian Blake spoke up, his tone skeptical. "You suggest we use ourselves as bait, Miss Marple. A bold plan." "Boldness, Sir Julian, is sometimes necessary," Agatha replied, her voice steady. "The artifact will be left in the observation car, ostensibly unguarded. From there we shall observe who comes to claim it." Sir Julian studied her for a moment before nodding. "Very well. Let's see how the game plays out." Night fell, casting the train in deep shadows as it wound through treacherous mountain terrain. The observation car was dimly lit, the artifact's box placed prominently on a table. Agatha and a small group of trusted passengers, including Sir Julian and Montague, waited in the adjacent corridor, concealed behind a heavy curtain. The minutes stretched long, every creak of the train heightening the tension. Finally, movement. A figure slipped into the observation car, their steps careful but determined. Agatha's heart quickened as the figure moved closer to the box. She nodded to her companions, signaling them to move in. But before they could act, the lights flickered and went out. Chaos erupted, a scuffle, a muffled curse, and then the slam of a door. When the lights returned, the box was gone, and Sir Julian stood over an overturned chair, his expression thunderous. "They've escaped." Agatha, remarkably calm, turned her sharp gaze to Julian. "Have they?" He blinked, his composure slipping. "What are you implying?" Agatha stepped closer, her voice soft but cutting. "I'm implying, Sir Julian, that betrayal often comes from the closest quarters. You knew of the plan because I told you directly. And yet, it was carried out with remarkable precision, almost as if someone had informed the culprit." Julian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Agatha sighed, her tone almost regretful. "It's you, isn't it? The calm observer, the financier of Harrington's expeditions, the one with both the means and the motive. Your alliance with Vossa was one of convenience, until it wasn't." Julian's expression hardened, the charm dropping like a discarded mask. "You're clever, Miss Marple, but cleverness won't save you." Before he could act, Montague stepped forward, holding a revolver with trembling hands. "Enough, Julian, it's over." Agatha regarded Montague with a calm nod. "Well done, Doctor. It seems justice has allies in the most unexpected places." As the train hurtled onward, the passengers' whispers rose once more. But for Agatha Marple, the game's conclusion was inevitable. She had drawn the mastermind into the light, and now the shadows would dissolve. The morning dawned cold and grey, casting long shadows through the Celestial Express as it wound its way through the mountains. The passengers were subdued, the weight of recent events pressing heavily on them. In the Grand Salon car, Agatha Marple stood at the center, her calm demeanor commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady but tinged with gravity, "I believe the time has come to shed light on the darkness that has engulfed this journey. The disappearances, the thefts, the lies, all of them converge on a single truth." Her gaze swept over the room, pausing briefly on Madame Dubois. The collector lounged in her seat, exuding an air of indifference that Agatha knew was a carefully constructed mask. The culprit behind these crimes is not an outsider or a shadowy figure beyond these walls, Agatha continued. It is someone among us, someone who has woven their charm and cunning into a web of deceit. Dubois's lips curved into a faint smile. Do get to the point, Miss Marple. The suspense is becoming tiresome. Agatha's expression didn't waver. Indeed, Madame Dubois, it is you who orchestrated these events. Your ties to Roland Vasseur, your knowledge of Harrington's artifact, your mastery of manipulation, it all points to you as the mastermind. The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Dubois's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, her tone sharp. A preposterous accusation. Do you have proof? I do, Agatha replied calmly. The journal found in Harrington's luggage contained detailed records of your dealings with Vasseur. Additionally, the counterfeit artifact, a clever ruse you used to throw suspicion elsewhere, was traced back to a dealer in Paris. A dealer with whom you have an extensive history. Dubois's composure cracked for the first time, her eyes narrowing. You're bluffing. Agatha's voice remained steady. I never bluff, madame. Your motive was clear. To secure dominance in the black market by eliminating those who could expose or challenge you. Harrington's stubborn refusal to yield the artifact and his penchant for dramatics made him an obvious target. As the tension in the room mounted, Dubois rose from her seat, her elegance now laced with fury. You speak as if you know everything, Miss Marple. But tell me, can you prove I had any part in the sabotage of this train? Agatha tilted her head slightly, her expression serene. I don't need to prove it. Your actions will do that for me. Dubois's gaze flickered toward the door, a subtle but telling movement. Agatha followed her line of sight and nodded toward the conductor, who stepped forward with a grave expression. Madame Dubois, the conductor said, I found this under your seat. He held up a small device, its wires exposed, a faint ticking sound emanating from within. Dubois's mask slipped entirely, replaced by cold defiance. You're clever, Miss Marple, she said, her voice low. But cleverness can only take you so far. She moved suddenly, knocking the conductor aside and bolting for the door. Agatha followed with surprising speed, her unassuming presence belying her agility. The chase led them to the engine room, where the roar of the train's machinery created a deafening backdrop. Dubois fumbled with the sabotage device, her hands shaking as she tried to conceal her actions. Stop this madness, Madame A. Agatha called out, her voice cutting through the noise. You've already lost. Don't take these innocent lives with you. Dubois turned, her face a mask of desperation. You don't understand. If Vasseur finds out I failed, I'm as good as dead. Perhaps, Agatha said, her tone softening, but this path will only ensure your destruction. Dubois hesitated, the device still clutched in her hands. It was the conductor who acted next, lunging forward to wrest the device from her grip. In the scuffle, it slipped to the floor, its ticking growing louder. Agatha moved swiftly, her hands steady as she examined the device. With seconds to spare, she found the mechanism and disabled it, silencing the ominous ticking. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the hum of the train. Dubois slumped to the floor, defeated, as the conductor restrained her. Agatha straightened, brushing off her skirt. A shame, madam. You might have achieved great things if only you had chosen a different path. As the train approached its final stop, the passengers began to emerge from their cabins, the ordeal behind them, but its weight still palpable. Agatha sat quietly by the window, her reflection blending with the passing countryside. The truth had been uncovered, the danger averted, but as always, the scars of greed, jealousy, and fear remained. For Agatha Marple, the train to perdition had lived up to its name, but she had ensured it reached its destination safely, if not unscathed. The Grand Salon car was awash in golden light from the crystal chandeliers, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. Agatha Marple stood at the center, her calm presence a stark contrast to the tension among the passengers. All eyes were on her as she produced a leather-bound journal and placed it on the table before her. Madame Dubois, Agatha began, her voice steady and precise. This journal, found among Dr. Harrington's belongings, contains detailed records of your transactions with Roland Vasseur. Its entries describe shipments of stolen artifacts, including the very disc Harrington so proudly displayed. Dubois, seated with her usual grace, lifted a perfectly arched brow. And what does that prove, Miss Marple? I am a collector, nothing more. Agatha's eyes sharpened. It proves your involvement in the black market, madame. But more importantly, it connects you to Harrington's disappearance. You see, the journal also references a shipment of counterfeit artifacts meant to deceive prospective buyers, a shipment you orchestrated. The passengers leaned forward, captivated by the unfolding drama. Dubois's composure began to falter, her fingers tightening around her cigarette holder. Your motive, Agatha continued, was to secure the real artifact by eliminating Harrington. When he refused to cooperate, you conspired to have him silenced. The blood trail in the luggage car was no accident, it was a calculated move to divert suspicion. Dubois's lips parted as if to protest, but Agatha pressed on. And finally, the sabotage device found in your possession. It was meant to derail the train, eliminating evidence and witnesses in one fell swoop. But your plan failed. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the train. Dubois looked around, seeking an ally among the passengers, but found none. Her shoulders sagged as she exhaled sharply. "You're clever, Miss Marple," Dubois said, her tone laced with bitterness. "Yes, I wanted the artifact, and yes, Harrington was a fool. But it was Vassar who demanded his silence, not me. He would have killed me if I hadn't acted." Agatha regarded her with a mixture of pity and resolve. "Perhaps, madame. But your choices were your own, and they led us here." Dubois slumped in defeat as the conductor approached, his expression grim. "I'll see to it that she is detained until we reach the authorities," he said, his voice heavy with resolve. As the train glided through rolling hills toward its final destination, the passengers began to emerge from their cabins, their expressions a mix of relief and exhaustion. The tension that had gripped the Celestial Express was slowly giving way to quiet reflection. Dr. Evelyn Montague sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. "I never thought I'd say this, but perhaps Harrington's theatrics served a purpose after all," she murmured. Sir Julian Blake, ever composed, chuckled dryly. A reminder, perhaps, that ambition without caution often leads to folly. Agatha sat a short distance away, her presence unobtrusive as always. She listened to the murmured conversations, satisfied that justice had been served. The train's luxurious interiors, once a stage for greed and deceit, now felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. As the Celestial Express pulled into the bustling station, the passengers gathered their belongings, eager to leave the events of the journey behind. Agatha, too, prepared to disembark, her small suitcase in hand. But, as she stepped into the corridor, a folded piece of paper slipped from her belongings. She picked it up, her sharp eyes narrowing as she read its contents. "Well played, Miss Marple. But the game is far from over, V." A faint smile touched her lips as she tucked the note into her pocket. The signature was unmistakable. Roland Vasseur, it seemed, had been orchestrating events from afar, his influence stretching beyond the confines of the train. As the train doors opened and the passengers stepped onto the platform, Agatha Marple walked with quiet purpose, her mind already turning to the next mystery. For every shadow revealed, another loomed on the horizon. The train to Perdition had reached its final stop, but Agatha's journey was far from over.